Hardly had 20 men gotten out before one machine gun started clattering, then two, then three. Bullets started smacking the lip of the trench like hailstones, making us pull down our heads. One man was shot right through the shoulder, squirting so much blood that he was surely to die. Even the stupidest understood that we were going to our deaths without even the slightest hope of success, simply to serve as living targets for the German machine gunners. That quote was penned by Corporal Louis Barthus of the French army while he served in World War I, and it lays bare the brutal realities of being on the receiving end of a machine gun. As for the exact machine gun in question, that would be this, the MG08, a German-made variant of the first machine gun ever made, the Maxim gun, an invention that is near unmatched in its most foul and loathsome impact upon the world, an impact that has not only seen countless millions slain directly by it, but many, many millions more slain by its descendants, be they direct descendants made in its image or spiritual ones built to the same base principles and ideas. And yet, despite that fact, or maybe even because of it, there is something uniquely fascinating about the Maxim gun, and as a result, pondering over it for a time naturally spawns many questions that we shall be answering for you today, because in the next 20-ish minutes, we shall thoroughly dissect both the design and the history of the Maxim gun. So let's begin. Big shout out to War Thunder for sponsoring today's video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made. Imagine taking command of over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships from 10 major nations. We're talking everything from the biplanes of the 1920s to today's high-tech fighter jets and main battle tanks. With War Thunder, you get to dive into epic PvP battles with stunning graphics and authentic sound effects that make you feel like you're right there in the action. One feature I really love is the in-depth customization. You can deck out your vehicles with historical markings, camouflage, and even decorations, some created by the War Thunder community. Whether you're rolling through the battlefield or take it to the skies, your ride is one of a kind. And here's the best part. You can now play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox. Just use my link in the video description below or the pinned comment to sign up. If you create a new account and haven't played in the last 6 months, you'll receive a massive bonus pack. 3 premium vehicles, 50% experience, an income booster, 2 advanced vehicles for rent, 100,000 silver lines, the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator, and 7 days of premium account time, among other goodies. Big thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring, and now back to the episode. Before we dive into the Maxim gun proper, it must be understood that it didn't just appear out of a technological vacuum. Instead, it was the result of a very long process of innovation, one in which mankind desperately yearned for a true machine gun, but could just never quite manage it. There was, for example, the Gatling gun, which was invented by Richard Gatling all the way back in 1861. While the first successful rapid-firing weapons, it featured multiple barrels arranged in a circular fashion around a central axis that also rotated when an operating hand crank was turned. This allowed for continuous firing as each barrel fired, ejected its spent cartridge, and was reloaded in succession, thus allowing for a constant and uninterrupted stream of fire without figuring out how the hell to cram hundreds of rounds a minute down a single barrel. To put this into perspective, the cyclic rate of fire on a Gatling, that being its rate of fire based solely on the weapon's mechanical capabilities, was about 200 to 300 rounds per minute on the early models, and given that they had 6 barrels, this meant that every barrel was actually only firing between 33 and 50 rounds per minute, way less than later true machine guns, and slow enough for the primitive technology of the mid-19th century to handle. But what gives? Some of you are no doubt thinking, if the Gatling gun was a weapon capable of putting 200 to 300 rounds a minute downrange, why doesn't it count as a machine gun? Well, to answer that, here is the definition of what a machine gun actually is according to ARCS, a gold standard firearms classification system published by the Armament Research Services, and quoting them here, a self-loading long gun chambered for a rifle cartridge and primarily intended for automatic fire from a bipod or mount. The issue comes from the words self-loading, because a Gatling gun didn't use the energy of a spent cartridge to load another. No, that was done via a human-powered hand crank. Thus, the Gatling gun was not self-loading, and so it was not a machine gun. It's pretty pedantic, we know, but given that our focus today is the first ever machine gun, it's important that we get these details right. Further to the Gatling gun, however, was also the Hotchkiss revolving cannon. Invented in 1872 by Benjamin Hotchkiss, it was actually a very different gun to the Gatling, despite what its appearance may first lead you to believe, as it used a single bolt that fed every barrel as it rotated, rather than a separate action for every barrel. As it typically fired rather meaty 37mm cannon rounds rather than the smaller 58 caliber rounds as used by most Gatlings, it had a much slower rate of fire, give or take 70 rounds per minute. It was also not a machine gun for the exact same reason that the Gatling gun wasn't. It was hand-cranked. Then there was the Nordenfeldt gun of 1873, an organ gun that had up to 12 separate barrels arranged in a straight row beside one another, like the pipes of a church organ, hence the name. This particular contraption was operated by turning a handle which loaded rounds into each of the barrel's chambers and then fired them off one by one in quick succession, as well as ejecting the spent brass. This clever system could happily put out around 600 rounds a minute cyclic on the big boy 12-barrel models, with each barrel having a nice pedestrian rate of around 50-ish rounds. As for the round it fired, it came in a range of different sizes up to 98 caliber, but a more modest 45 caliber was the most common. But while clever, once again, it was operated by hand, so it's not a machine gun. Instead, as we already know, it would be the Maxim gun that would claim the mantle as the first true machine gun. So let's move on and discover what it was all about. The Maxim gun is named after its inventor, the American-born Hiram Maxim. According to an 1896 article in the Times newspaper, its seeds were first planted when one of Maxim's friends leaned over to him and said that if he wanted to make some serious money, he should, quote, invent something that will enable these Europeans to cut each other's throats with greater facility. Whether or not this really was what got Maxim's noggin jogging, we will likely never know. But what we do know is that when he was set on the idea, sometime in either 1882 or 1883, he started by looking at what other fast-firing guns were already on offer, specifically the Gatling, the Gardner, and the Hotchkiss. Upon looking at them, however, Maxim was not impressed, to say the least. Multiple barrels, hand-operated, gravity-fed magazines, it was all far too cumbersome and far too clunky for his tastes, and he decided that whatever he made would have to be far more handy, compact, and efficient, with him eventually settling upon a fully automatic, single-barrel configuration. But that was easier said than done, as such a firearm had never been made before. So, what did he do? Tinkering with semi-automatic rifles turned out to be the answer to that question, with a view to eventually scaling them up into something more meaty and fully automatic. This led to him filing his first firearms-related patent on the 26th of June 1883 for a recoil-operated Winchester rifle. Annoyingly, this particular patent falls within the dead zone of the late 19th century British patents, which are an absolute nightmare to access, so we are unable to show you exactly what it was he filed. But luckily he went on a firearms patent filing bonanza following this, so we are able to show a later one, which he filed on the 9th of June 1885 in the United States, again for developments in recoil-operated rifles. Behold. Back to 1884 now, however, because that was the year that he, with his initial experiments in recoil-operated rifles having gone rather well, established a modest little workshop in London and began experimenting on developing a truly fully automatic machine gun. Soon enough, this led to the development of prototype guns, but they were very different from the finalized Maxim. We'll spare you most of the technological details, as after all, they were just prototypes, and therefore knowing their full ins and outs isn't that important for your overall understanding. But there is a detail that's worth noting, if for no other reason that it is so weird that it becomes fascinating, and that's the fact that they were vacuum operated. Now, you didn't mishear us there, they were vacuum operated. This was a totally new one, even for us, but worry not, because after spending way too long researching what the hell this system was, we're able to report that it worked by using the firing of a round to create a vacuum within a sealed chamber, resulting in a pressure difference. This difference then moved a piston, which cycled the bolt to eject the spent cartridge and load a new one. Further to just that very novel operating system, however, Maxim also added a handy-dandy external lever that could adjust the rate of fire from anywhere from 2, not 200, 2, all the way through to 666 rounds a minute, a figure that was nothing if not ironic when one considers the absolutely demonic impact it would go on to have on the world. Such a potential rate of fire also made cooling a big priority, and as a solution, Maxim devised a water jacket that one simply filled with water that would absorb the heat that built up on the barrel, and then swiftly swapped out from time to time to keep the barrel nice and cool during sustained firing. Between all of that, the job was a good one. It was now 1885 and Maxim had just made the first ever machine gun. But remember when I said that they were prototype guns? Well, yeah, while they might have been legit machine guns, they weren't exactly what you'd call practical, because mounted to a tripod, they were 157 centimeters long, 107 centimeters tall, and weighed 64 kilos, without ammunition. We would say that they were really more automatic cannons than machine guns, but as we're being for pedantry in today's episode, and our source for this segment, the Vickers Maxim machine gun by Martin Pegler, doesn't specify the caliber of these prototypes, we are unable to say with any certainty that they had a caliber of 20mm or greater, and therefore were technically cannons. But while they may have been big, their size didn't make them any less impressive, because when Maxim showed them off at the Institution of Mechanical Engineers in April 1885, they went down an absolute storm, and later that same year, they also earned Maxim a gold medal at the International Inventions Exhibition. Despite the hype, however, Maxim still wasn't satisfied. The vacuum system was horrifically unreliable, as was the recoil spring. The ammunition belts were also far too heavy, which often strained the feed mechanisms and caused malfunctions. But while he may not have been satisfied, he was a very savvy businessman, and so he capitalized on the ever-growing hype by founding the Maxim Gun Company and quickly raised £50,000, a little over £5 million adjusted for inflation, through the sale of shares. One person in particular bought the lion's share of those shares, and that was one Albert Vickers, who, along with his brother Tom, co-owned Vickers Son & Company Limited, a giant of the British steel industry. This saw Maxim's enterprise get absorbed by Vickers, which would later formally change its name to Vickers, Sons and Maxim in 1897. Not that any of this changed much for Maxim, besides how much money he made, because he remained in his workshop, continuing work on what he had come to call the perfect guns, i.e. the finalized Maxim gun. The exact date he finished the work is unclear, but we do know that come March of 1887, he had 3 perfect gun prototypes completed and ready to go, 2 water-cooled models that retained the earlier prototype's water jacket and weighed in at 27 kilos, and 1 air-cooled model that weighed in at a much more modest 18 kilos. While they may not look like it, thanks to the very Victorian excessive brass festooning them, these were mechanically fully finalized. So let's now bring this chapter to an end and learn about how they worked. We already know that Maxim's original vacuum tube firing system, while certainly innovative, was ultimately a little bit shit. So what did he replace it with in the final Maxim gun? Well, that would be with a recoil-operated system instead, a type of system that works by using the recoil force generated when a round is fired to perform the ejection of the spent case, the chambering of a new round, and the cocking of the firing mechanism. In a Maxim specifically, because a lot of varieties of this system have emerged over the years, it works by having the barrel and breech block recoil together upon firing. This compresses a spring and unlocks the breech. The recoil force then ejects the spent cartridge while a new round is chambered, and the spring then pushes the barrel and breech block back into their original position, locking them together and preparing the gun for the next shot. This system allows a Maxim to achieve a rate of fire of give or take 600 rounds per minute, a figure that, with some exceptions, more or less remains the standard machine gun rate of fire to this very day. As for how the ammunition-hungry beast was fed, Maxim kept the belt-fed mechanism from his earlier prototypes, and this, again, pretty much remains the standard for all machine guns to this very day. He ended up using a clever arrangement that once again capitalized on the gun's recoil, because as the gun fired, the recoil moved a feed block mechanism that pulled the belt, positioning the next cartridge in line with the chamber. The bolt then pushed the cartridge into the chamber for firing, while the spent belt exited the gun. Despite both air and water-cooled prototypes having been made, the vast majority of Maxim guns that were made would be water-cooled. We already know how this worked. Bullet goes bang, makes barrel hot, water around barrel absorbs hot and makes barrel not hot. So we're not going to dwell too much on this, but we will point out a couple of details that are either specific to the final design or that we haven't mentioned yet. Those being that it carried around 4 liters of water and thus added about 4 kilograms of weight to the gun when full, and it also had a handy-dandy steam tube to allow the escape of steam produced by the heated water, a pretty useful feature if you aren't partial to your own gun sporadically blowing up under steam pressure. As for how heavy one was, that naturally varied ever so depending on the exact variant because, as we will soon get to, lots of different countries ended up adopting it, but for a general figure, call it 27 kilos for one of Maxim's own made guns on a tripod, unloaded and with an empty cooling jacket, and call it in the low to mid 30s for a ready-to-go bang one. And so now that we know all about what a Maxim gun actually was, let's move on and see how they were used. As we've said, A lot of militaries ended up adopting the Maxim gun over the years, so invariably this chapter is going to have to be a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but I'll give you the gist. We could quite literally do a whole video on just this matter and still not have enough time to do it justice. As far as we're currently aware, the British military was the first to use the Maxim, with them placing an order for 6 of them in March 1887, and then going on to order even more in the coming years as their use proved most satisfactory. And with it being Victorian Britain, you can probably guess where they ended up deploying them. That would be Africa. Naturally, with 19th century Africa not exactly being the most developed place, their use was absolutely devastating and led to a string of victories that really vindicated the stereotype of a pith helmet-clad Anglo, mowing down a simply sickening number of natives with impunity. For examples, consider the 1898 Battle of Atbara, in which a mere 2 Maxims allowed the British to kill 3,000 Mahdists while suffering only 26 dead themselves, and the Battle of Omdurman, also in 1898, in which the British, this time equipped with 6 Maxims, killed 12,000 Mahdists while suffering only 47 killed themselves. As for when the Maxim gun was first in combat at all, while we do know when that was, weirdly, we actually know very little about the incident. It occurred in 1887 after famed American explorer Henry Morton Stanley brought one to Africa somehow, because how he acquired one at such an early stage remains a total mystery. He ended up using it in combat in Mombasa. As for whom he used it against and the results thereof, that remains a mystery. This one particular Maxim also had quite a peculiar history, because it later fell into the hands of the English explorer Frederick Lagarde, again, don't ask us how, who then used it in combat in Uganda in 1892 after a religious war broke out between Protestants and Catholics. So why do we bring this up? Well, chiefly because it affords us the opportunity to include a quote concerning its use there that very accurately encapsulates the situation in Africa more broadly. Quoting here, "All of a sudden, I saw bullets begin to rain on the royal hut, making a terrible noise in the copse that surrounded us. It was the Maxim mitrailleuse, which joined its fire to that of boats loaded with soldiers. Just a few canoes, and a crowd of 3,000 or 4,000 throwing themselves in the water to escape the bullets. It was heartbreaking. What shrieks. What a fusillade. What deaths from drowning." The quote ends. The Maxim proved to be so successful, in fact, that come World War I, basically every major military in the world had adopted it in one form or another. The British, having previously just used off-the-shelf Maxims, adopted their own dedicated variant in their standard issue .303 caliber in 1912, known colloquially as the Vickers gun. It would remain in service with them all the way through until 1968. The Germans adopted their own 7.92 by 57mm variant in 1901, which they called the MG01, which they would later further improve on as the MG08 in, yeah, you guessed it, 1908. This is also the same MG08 that we mentioned in the introduction. Although increasingly superseded by more modern machine guns as the years went on, the MG08 would remain in service until 1945. For the Austro-Hungarians, their variant was the Schwarzlose machine gun, which they also adopted in 1908. Made in a range of calibers, it remained in service until 1948. In fact, this is going to take way too long rattling them off the old-fashioned way. Here's just a big on-screen list of countries that adopted it in one form or another. And bear in mind that this list is not comprehensive, so vast was the use of the Maxim. Generally speaking, all of these powers adopted it in either the late 19th or early 20th century, and come the mid-20th century, it was gone, replaced by more modern and versatile machine guns. But there is one very notable and interesting exception to this trend, which we will zoom in on as we bring this video to a close. The specific variant we refer to is the Russian and Soviet one, the M1910. So what makes this one such a buck to the trend? Well, that would be the fact that it is in service to this very day. And we don't mean there's a lot of them in a warehouse somewhere, so it still is technically on the books, as it were. Nope, it is used in frontline combat. And given that we are discussing the Russian/Soviet variant, you've probably already guessed exactly where. And that's in Ukraine. You see, while the Soviets may have replaced it with some more modern machine guns such as the RPD, PKM, and RPK after World War II, they were always one to assume the worst and prepare for disaster. And so while some of them were sent as aid to satellite states, the vast majority were lathered up in Greece, chucked into crates, and stored in warehouses all across the Soviet Union just in case World War III kicked off and they found themselves getting desperate. Naturally, Ukraine had more than its fair share of these warehouses, which remained largely unmolested once the wall came down. And so, when faced with a Russian-backed insurgency in 2014 and eventually a full-on Russian invasion in 2022, what happened to those still perfectly serviceable Maxim guns? Well, they came out of hibernation to do their part once again. And so it stands that the first machine gun ever made, the design of which is nearly pushing 140 years old, is still on the battlefield to this day, with no sign of it calling it quits anytime soon. It has outlived so many of the younger upstarts who sought to replace it. Before you go today, make sure you do check out today's fantastic sponsor, War Thunder. If you create a new account and haven't played in the last 6 months, you'll receive a massive bonus pack. 3 premium vehicles, 50% experience, an income booster, among other goodies. There is a link below where you can play for free, so check it out. Thank you to them for sponsoring, and bye for now.